Before sitting down with Ukraine's president, Donald Trump made another call first, to Moscow. And what happened in that dining room at Mar-a-Lago, followed by what was said at the press conference afterward, has Washington asking a question that won't go away. Who is actually driving American policy on Ukraine? This is a story about phone calls and timing, about public statements and private conversations, about alliances that were built over decades, and the questions now emerging about whether those foundations are shifting. What we witnessed this past Sunday wasn't just another diplomatic meeting. It was a moment that crystallized concerns that have been building for months across European capitals, within the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and among America's traditional allies. The sequence of events matters, the details matter, and the implications extend far beyond a single afternoon in Florida. Here's what we know from public reporting. On Sunday morning, Trump posted on social media that he'd just finished a phone call with Vladimir Putin. He described it as good and very productive. That call happened just hours before Trump was scheduled to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The timing itself is revealing. In traditional diplomacy, a U.S. president typically consults with allies before engaging with adversaries. The standard protocol would be to speak with the Ukrainian president first, understand their position, coordinate messaging, and then engage with Moscow from a unified stance. But that's not what happened here. Instead, Trump spoke with Putin first, then met with Zelensky, then, according to his own statements, planned to call Putin again afterward to brief him on the Zelensky meeting. This represents a fundamental reversal of the traditional diplomatic sequence, and it didn't go unnoticed. The meeting itself took place in the main dining room of Mar-a-Lago, not the Oval Office, not a formal diplomatic setting, a dining room. This matters more than it might initially appear. When foreign leaders visit Washington, the venue sends a message. Meetings in the Oval Office carry the weight of the presidency. Sessions in the cabinet room signal serious policy discussion. Even meetings at Camp David, while more casual, represent a level of respect and confidentiality. But a dining room at a private club in Florida? That's a different message entirely. It suggests informality to the point of casualness. And when the visiting leader represents a nation fighting for its survival against a much larger adversary, that casualness takes on additional meaning. When Zelensky arrived in Florida, according to multiple reports, no U.S. official greeted him at the airport. Only Ukraine's own ambassador was there. Think about what that means in diplomatic terms. When a head of state visits another country, particularly during wartime, particularly when that visit involves crucial negotiations, protocol dictates that representatives of the host nation greet them upon arrival. It's not just courtesy. It's a signal of respect, importance, and allied status. The absence of any American official at Zelensky's arrival was noticed immediately by diplomatic observers. Some called it an oversight. Others saw it as a deliberate signal. Either interpretation is troubling. One suggests dysfunction, the other suggests intentional disrespect. Compare that to the reception Putin received in Anchorage during an earlier diplomatic engagement, where a red carpet was literally rolled out. The optics alone raised eyebrows, but what came next raised far more questions. During the brief press availability with Zelensky, Trump made a series of statements that foreign policy analysts are still trying to parse. He said Russia wants to see Ukraine succeed. Let's pause there. Russia invaded Ukraine. Over 2 years of war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, cities reduced to rubble. And the American president is saying Russia wants Ukraine to succeed? Watch Zelensky's face in that moment. The footage has been circulating widely. There's a visible reaction, a slight glance, something between disbelief and diplomatic restraint. It's worth pausing on this moment because it reveals something important. Zelensky is a wartime leader who has spent years navigating impossible diplomatic situations. He's met with dozens of world leaders. He's made countless public appearances under extraordinary pressure. He knows how to maintain composure. But in that moment, when Trump claimed Russia wants to see Ukraine succeed, something broke through. The reaction was subtle, a raised eyebrow, a quick glance, a fleeting expression, but it was there. and it spoke volumes about the disconnect between what was being said in that press conference and the reality on the ground in Ukraine. For context, at the very moment this press conference was happening, Russian forces were actively shelling Ukrainian positions. Missile strikes on civilian infrastructure had intensified. The idea that Russia wants Ukraine to succeed, while simultaneously prosecuting a war of territorial conquest, represents a fundamental misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the situation. Trump went further. He said Putin had been very generous in his feeling toward Ukraine, mentioning potential energy deals and economic cooperation. These are claims that run directly counter to what we're seeing on the ground, where Russian missile strikes on civilian infrastructure have actually intensified in recent weeks, according to monitoring groups. Then came the question about a ceasefire. Ukraine has publicly stated it would support a temporary ceasefire, 60 to 90 days, to allow for a referendum on territorial issues in eastern regions. But when asked if Russia agreed to a ceasefire, Trump's answer was immediate: not a ceasefire. He explained that Putin believes stopping and then potentially restarting hostilities would put Russia in a bad position. Trump said he understands that position. Think about what that means. The Ukrainian position: temporary halt to allow diplomacy. The Russian position, as described by Trump: no pause in fighting. And the American president says he understands Russia's reasoning. This is where the diplomatic implications become particularly stark. By expressing understanding for Russia's rejection of a ceasefire, Trump is effectively endorsing the continuation of active combat. He's siding with the aggressor's timeline rather than supporting the victim's call for a pause. Military analysts have noted that Russia's opposition to a ceasefire makes strategic sense from Moscow's perspective. They currently hold occupied territory, and a pause would allow Ukraine to regroup, rearm, and potentially retake ground. From that standpoint, Russia benefits from continued fighting. But for an American president to publicly validate that calculus represents a significant departure from decades of U.S. foreign policy doctrine. Traditionally, the United States has positioned itself as a broker seeking to end conflicts, not as a party expressing understanding for why one side wants to keep fighting. But here's where the timeline becomes particularly significant. Trump revealed he'd been on the phone with Putin for almost 2.5 hours that morning. He made a point of saying they didn't talk about the weather. Then, after meeting with Zelensky, Trump announced he would be calling Putin again. So let's map this out. Morning: 2.5-hour call with Putin. Afternoon: meeting with Zelensky. Evening: another call with Putin planned. This creates a sandwich pattern: Putin, Zelensky. Putin that raises fundamental questions about the negotiating structure. Is the U.S. acting as an independent broker, or is it coordinating positions with one party before and after meeting with the other? The length of the morning call is also significant. 2.5 hours is an extraordinarily long time for a head-of-state phone conversation. For comparison, typical calls between presidents usually last 20 to 45 minutes. Emergency situations might extend to an hour, but 2.5 hours suggests either an extensive agenda or a very detailed level of discussion. What gets discussed in a 2.5-hour call? According to Trump's own acknowledgement, not the weather. That means substantive policy discussion, detailed positions, possibly negotiating language, terms, conditions, and frameworks. According to the Kremlin's own readout, which was published by Russian state media, Trump initiated the morning call. They claim Trump proposed continuing settlement talks through specially created working groups. The Russian statement also said that Trump and Putin hold broadly similar views, that a temporary ceasefire would only prolong the conflict. That's the Kremlin's characterization. Trump's team hasn't disputed it. During the press conference, a reporter asked Trump what he and Putin talked about for 2.5 hours. Trump's response: "We discussed a lot of things. We didn't talk about the weather. We weren't talking about what a beautiful day it is in Palm Beach." But he didn't specify what was discussed. What we do know from the Kremlin readout: Ukraine's settlement framework, economic cooperation prospects. Understandings reached, in previous discussions. The urgency of Kyiv making decisions without delay. That last phrase, without delay, is particularly noteworthy. It suggests pressure for Ukraine to make territorial concessions quickly before the military situation potentially changes. But there's something else worth examining in that Kremlin statement. The phrase, understandings reached in previous discussions. This implies there have been other conversations, other agreements, other frameworks discussed in channels we may not be fully aware of. What understandings? Reached when? With whom? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're fundamental to understanding what's actually being negotiated and whether the American position is being developed independently or in coordination with Moscow. The Kremlin statement also mentioned economic cooperation prospects. This is significant because it suggests discussions have moved beyond just ending the war to what comes after. Trade relationships, business deals, economic integration. These are exactly the kinds of incentives that Putin has historically used to influence policy decisions in other countries. This isn't happening in isolation. Remember Helsinki in 2018? Trump stood next to Putin and said he believed Putin's denial of election interference over the assessment of U.S. intelligence agencies. That moment shocked the American foreign policy establishment. Not because presidents can't disagree with intelligence assessments, but because Trump took Putin's word over that of his own government, publicly, while standing next to the Russian leader. The optics were devastating. Intelligence professionals called it unprecedented. Former CIA directors from both parties expressed alarm. The message it sent to allies was clear. The traditional U.S. commitment to intelligence-based policymaking was no longer reliable, and here we are, years later, seeing a similar pattern. Not identical, but parallel. Public statements that align closely with Moscow's preferred narrative. Expressions of understanding for Russian positions. A diplomatic approach that seems to prioritize maintaining good relations with Putin over supporting traditional allies. Remember the 2016 campaign? Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails. During Sunday's press conference, Trump brought up what he called the Russia hoax again. He said he and Putin would commiserate about it during phone calls. He said they'd call each other and say, "Can you believe the stuff they're making up?" Think about what's being described there. Private phone calls with Putin, discussing domestic American political investigations. Calls that apparently weren't always disclosed publicly. While this is unfolding, watch what's happening across the Atlantic. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Zelensky this week. He announced $22.5 billion in economic assistance for Ukraine. He spoke about standing with Ukraine during this difficult time and the barbarism of recent attacks on Kyiv. The contrast in tone and substance couldn't be starker. Carney didn't hedge. He didn't express understanding for Russia's position. He didn't suggest Ukraine should hurry up and make concessions. Instead, he committed significant resources. $22.5 billion is not a symbolic figure, and spoke in clear moral terms about aggression and resistance. The Canadian assistance package includes loan guarantees, direct financial aid, and support for post-war reconstruction planning. It's structured to unlock additional funding from international institutions like the IMF and World Bank. In other words, it's designed to have multiplier effects far beyond the headline number. This is what Allied support traditionally looks like: clear commitment, substantial resources, and unambiguous moral positioning. The fact that Canada, with a GDP roughly 1/12 the size of the United States, is taking such a strong stance, while America's position remains ambiguous, has not gone unnoticed in European capitals. European leaders are watching closely. And according to diplomatic sources, there's growing concern about what one official described as unpredictability in the American position. That's diplomatic language for alarm.